name is Reverend Kendall Ray Rothis, and I am honored to be speaking with you today. I've been brooding on Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, which says, "The earth was formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." It's interesting. Our Bible begins with formlessness, with a void, with darkness. Lately, this image of a formless void has been resonating with me. It's certainly not the most exciting or comforting image, but I want you to imagine it with me, okay? Like, get a picture in your mind. Take a few deep breaths and really imagine it, this vast emptiness. Other translations call it a waste, desolate, unsightly, empty. And once you have a picture in your mind, not just of what it looks like, but what it feels like, what it sounds like, then I want you to wonder a little further and think about whether there's anything in your life or in our world that feels to you like that void feels, like that emptiness, that great big emptiness feels. And I know I'm inviting you to make some possibly painful connections here, but if you go there with me in your imagination, I promise to guide you back out, okay? I just want you to think for a minute what inside of me feels like that empty void. I know I've experienced things that feel like voids to me. Grief, depression, heartache, loss, fear, confusion. Anybody with me? I'm guessing I'm not alone in this. And then I think about this pandemic, right? We've been living with it for months now, and it feels to me a lot like a darkness, like a formless void. We've been thrown into a situation that is scary, and we don't have a lot of answers. We don't know when businesses will start to thrive again. We don't know how many more people will die. We don't know if their economy will recover or if someone we know and love will get sick. We don't know when a vaccine will be made available. We don't know if we've been too cautious or taken too many risks. All these months in, and we still don't know exactly what kind of threat we are up against. It's like a formless void, and we don't know what will emerge on the other side. What I love about the formless void in Genesis chapter 1 is that the Spirit of God hovers there, right there. Right where we think things are all emptiness and chaos, that's where God hangs out, where God sits to think God's thoughts and dream God's dreams. It's in the formless void that God's imagination goes wild. So as it turns out, that darkness hovering over the surface of the deep, it's not dark like a grave or dark like a black hole. It's dark like a womb, like a uterus, like a great big belly about to give birth. Womanist scholar Dr. Will Gaffney says that in the beginning the world was bathed in life-giving darkness. She points out that, quote, in the scriptures from Exodus to Deuteronomy, from Psalms to Samuel, from Kings to Chronicles, darkness is the holy abode of God. She says it is in the shadow that the Holy Spirit wraps the Virgin Mary, overshadowing her and the holy life in the holy darkness of her womb. and there is the life-giving darkness before the dawn of creation. The God we meet in Genesis teaches there is nothing to fear in the darkness, for that is where God spins the web of life. End quote. What if this is true about darkness? Not just in some cosmic sense, but also in the here and now realities of our life. That wherever you feel the most lack, the most void, the most empty, the most ugh, God hangs out there. You may think you're abandoned, but actually God is right there with you, thinking God's thoughts and dreaming God's dreams. Right in your emptiest, shallowest place, God's imagination is about to go wild. Something in you is trying to get itself born. It's a pretty cool thought. But what do we do about it? Like, some of us have been sitting with great big voids in our chest or guts for a very long time and no signs of life yet. Do we just keep sitting? Do we have a role to play? I mean, in the creation story, God just sort of speaks and it happens, right? Let there be light, and voila, there was light. But like, who was God speaking to if there was no one to hear? I mean, if no one else was there, wouldn't it have been enough for God to just think God's thoughts and dream God's dreams? Why did God have to say something out loud? Is it possible that thing that was supposed to become light had to be listening, waiting even to be called forth? Maybe the thing that would be light heard God's voice and responded, and then light became. I'm not, of course, talking literally here. This is not a science sermon. I'm speaking from my imagination, and what I am imagining is God speaking into what looks like a void. And then the light potential responds to God's voice. And from that exchange, light is born. In other words, what I am imagining is that you and I are invited to participate in God's creative activity in the world. That when God hovers over our empty places, God is waiting for us to show up too. God wants us to hover there alongside the Spirit, waiting, listening to be called forth. I think that this means that for the full potential, the full creative potential to be birthed in us, we have to go there first, go to the void, to the source of pain and unrest, and then listen for what gets spoken into the void. Listen for the words spoken there that have generative power. Now, to be honest, again and again in my life, I have avoided and suppressed my darker feelings because I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to face what was hidden inside. It was scary. It felt like a void. It felt like darkness. It felt like too many unknowns and too many big emotions. But again and again in my life, I have felt the nudge to go there anyway, despite my fears and my discomfort. It's never been easy to do it. It's always required a lot of inner work, a lot of unpleasant feelings, a lot of talking to trusted friends and usually a therapist and a spiritual guide of some sort. And it's never been a fast journey. It's taken me time to get all the way down to the center of the pain and then to hover there instead of running away. The hovering is probably even more difficult than the arriving. But when I do, and I mean really do it, without fail, it becomes the place of transformation. without fail, it becomes the place of transformation. I find God there. New stuff gets born there. Little miracles happen. Poetry and art and self-understanding get created there. It's like the potential light in me that had just been hanging out on the periphery finally goes deep enough and gets quiet enough to hear God speak to it. And it stops being potential and starts coming out of me alive. Now, I don't think that God sends us painful voids on purpose, as if God needed us to suffer. I think the voids happen. But because God is always there in them, that means creative potential exists side by side with the pain. Like, I don't think God sent us this pandemic, for example, as if God wanted people to get sick and die. No, God is a healer. But I do think God hovers over and around this pandemic, over and around each of us, over and around our fears, our losses, our anxieties. And I believe there is an invitation for us to sink deep enough and get quiet enough to hear God speak to our budding potential. Who are we supposed to be, to become, and what might this worldwide halting be helping us to hear? When I think about the image of the formless void, when I think about visiting the pain in me, the discomfort in me, I don't just think about my personal losses, and I don't just think of this pandemic. I also think of the racial unrest in our country. I think of George Floyd's death. I think of Breonna Taylor's death, of protests erupting across the nation, of a polarized country. This feels like a pretty big darkness to me. And if my past history has anything to warn me about, it's that I will be tempted not to go there, not to feel the feelings rising up in me, not to dig any deeper. But if my past history can reassure me of anything, it's that I'm being asked by the Holy One to go there anyway. Because where the darkness is, there the Spirit hovers. I read this book last year entitled White Fragility, Why It Is So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, in which the author, Robin DiAngelo, a white woman, talks about how quick we are, as white people, to get defensive when the topic of racism comes up. I think it's pretty common to get defensive when we feel uncomfortable. But what if our defenses get in the way of us encountering God? What if the Spirit of God is there, where our discomfort lies, inviting us to hover there too, ready to listen and to learn? DiAngelo's book helped me to hover over the black cloud of racism and not run away, but listen really closely for what I might have been missing, even if that new knowledge made me feel bad. She helped me hang out there for a while because that's what I needed to do, what I still need to do. She said one thing in particular that I believe all white people have to sit with and grasp hold of if we're going to make any progress, which is that too often we are operating with the wrong definition of racism. What she said was this, quote, "It became clear that if I believed that only bad people who intended to hurt others because of race could ever do so, I would respond with outrage to any suggestion that I was involved in racism." So, for example, if I think only the really bad apples, like that rogue police officer who murdered George Floyd, are capable of racism, and I have nothing to do with that sort of violence, then it is going to be offensive when protesters insist that I do have something to do with it. She writes, "Of course that belief about what racism is would make me feel falsely accused of something terrible. And of course I would want to defend my character. I came to see that the way we are taught to define racism makes it virtually impossible for white people to understand it. Given our racial insulation coupled with misinformation, any suggestion that we are complicit in racism is a kind of unwelcome and insulting shock to the system. If, however, I understand racism as a system into which I was socialized, I can receive feedback on my problematic racial patterns as a helpful way to support my learning and growth." She writes, "To the degree we think we have arrived, we will put our energy into making sure that others see us as having arrived. None of our energy will go into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, engaging in ongoing self-awareness, continuing education, relationship building, and actual anti-racist practice. We do indeed uphold and perpetrate racism, but our defensiveness and certitude make it virtually impossible to explain to us how we do so." Friends, I am convinced that when we enter into the hard, difficult stuff, God is waiting there for us. In fact, it's where God has been hovering all along, right at the heart of the world's pain, thinking God's thoughts and dreaming God's dreams. And I don't want to miss out on God's dreams because I'm too scared to go there. Even if the process is painful, I want the new life that comes on the other side of dying to the self, to the ego, to the old ways of thinking that have kept me trapped and stuck. Here is your invitation during these times in which we are living. Go hover where God hovers. Move towards the void, the pain, the place where you don't have good answers. Travel into the darkness, and when you get there, sit down, stay a while, get quiet, and listen. This will be the place of transformation for you. Don't be afraid of the dark. I mean, you probably are afraid of the dark and can't really help it. But take a deep breath and go there anyway. When you arrive, may you meet God's Spirit, and may you give birth to your life's full potential. Amen.